So getting back to how Mouse ruined comics.
Okay.
All right, 30 seconds. Your 30 seconds are up. No more boomer music.
Stop right there, criminal scum.
I tell you what, this is a weird. I hadn't stopped to think about this, folks. I'm getting ahead of myself. It's Wednesday. It's another episode of the Mattriarchy. I am, of course, your host from beautiful and sunny Scottsbluff, Nebraska, Matt Reese, and I am joined by not your normal cast of characters. Actually, we've got some repeated folks, yeah, but I mean not the usual guys, and specifically, Omega Girl writer and top shill, Twitless is not here tonight. He had some stuff come up, and he couldn't make it, and that's okay because I almost didn't make it. I almost didn't make it, so it's fine.
That would have been interesting.
It has been times I didn't make it to my own show. That's okay. So, but anyhow,
see, as I was saying, if we were set up with you had a better computer, we were running everything through actual OBS. Times you can't make it, I could literally just set up a profile and run it from my end.
That's true. That is true. So, Metal's got all kinds of ideas to come kicking and dragging into the 21st century.
Yeah, we just have to make sure your computer can support it, which at the current time, that's skeptical.
Oh man. Well, that was part of the thing too. Is we did an interview. We're looking to hire somebody new at my agency in my day job, and for the thing, time frame scheduling was weird, so we're gonna do it on a Zoom call, and my computer just took a dive just right at the beginning of the thing, and I had to restart it, and it took an hour and a half to finish restarting.
Oh.
So when I got here to the studio, also known as my bedroom, it was still coming up. So everything had a load.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is you use Zoom.
Yeah.
But
Fair enough.
Although it could have been worse with we use Teams at work, and oh my god, I would rather use Zoom than Teams any day because Teams is a Microsoft product. It is horrible.
Yep. Yeah, I sometimes wonder exactly how Microsoft gained dominance in its industry.
They copied everybody else, and
well, the thing about that is you're not wrong, but think about the Office suite, right? They copied everyone else so well and improved on them that they became the standard bearer. That everyone started copying them, and then once they developed the format of how Office programs should work, then they're like, now that we've created the industry standard, how do we screw it up? How do we make something so terrible no one will want to use it, but they'll have to?
Yeah, well, here's the biggest thing. They got all the contracts with the governments. That's the whole. That's one of the biggest things.
That's where it starts.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody. That's the question you got to ask, though. Would you rather be Fulton, or would you rather be I forgot the guy's name. Southern. Never mind.
Well, speaking of getting in with the governments,
I had a great comparison with the robber barons, but I can't remember it now. I can't remember the other dude's name.
And that was a good segue.
Biltmore. Vanderbilt.
Yeah.
Vanderbilts. That's what I was trying to say.
Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt.
Yeah,
I'd rather be Vanderbilt. Yeah. Sort of.
I think I'd rather be Rockefeller.
Yeah. If you're going to pick them. So anyhow, tonight we are talking, Neil, thanks for joining us. Tonight we are talking about everybody's favorite thing, gun registration. I mean, superhero registration, which is never, ever a thinly veiled metaphor for stealing your guns.
Yep.
I mean, it could also be a metaphor for terrorism.
Well, that's true. Or, government overreach or anything. But anyway, it's never ever a metaphor for taking your guns. So today we've joined by the metal, of course, and I have, and we've got Larry there.
Hmm?
We've got
Chuck, and I'm going to put on my hat today as a scholar of international studies and political science.
Ooh, that's fun. And Cartoonicus rounds out our merry band.
Stay tuned.
How is it going? Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited. So, first of all, I want to go ahead and start with a story. And I believe I have told this story on stream before, but I never get sick of complaining about things. So, back in the early 2000s, my buddy Chris, co-founder of Ideal Comics, he comes to me and he says, "Hey, did you hear about this Civil War thing?" And I said, "What?" He said, "They're doing this thing in Marvel." I said, "Okay." I said, they're gonna have for some reason where the heroes are gonna be forced to register." And I said, "Well, that's stupid." And he's like, "Well, I'm not finished yet." I said, "No, it's on its face stupid." He's like, "Well, do you have any interest in reading it?" I said, "No." So, what do you mean it's on its face stupid? I said, "Chris, the fundamental underlying premise of a superhero universe is that the individual has the right to act on behalf of justice."
Yep.
It's primary. You don't have a superhero universe where you have Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, Spider-Man, Daredevil, any of them, unless you have the philosophical presumption that the individual is just in acting on behalf of justice, right? And that's totally in line with the Declaration of Independence, right? Where citizens create government to protect inalienable rights, but that means that government grows out of the will of the people. So they have intrinsic within themselves the rights to defense, life, liberty, property, all that kind of stuff. It has to start with the individual and the family before it can go out from there. So I said, so it's crazy. Well, it turns out that I was completely right about Civil War, and it's a giant trash fire, and we're not here to talk about that per se, but we are here to talk about the concept of superhero registration in comics. Can it be done well? Should it be done at all? And we've already got some lively comments popping in from the chat. Neo says, My Hero Academia. Oh, come on. Pick on this. What's the deal? Where does my mouse go? Technology, why do you hate me? It's not even picking up the screen. My other mouse isn't working. Oh, well.
Yep.
Fine.
We'll just have to deal.
We're just going to have to talk. Well, can you?
Well, I mean, I can absolutely show the comment if that's what you were trying to do.
That's exactly what I was trying to do, was show a comment on the screen to mention that My Hero Academia and Tiger and Bunny are two examples of how heroes...
I would throw One Punch Man into there, too.
Yes, absolutely. One Punch Man is very... And it's interesting, too, because these are, you can even say, successful discussions of that within a superhero context, but within a Japanese context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where
I prefer
Japanese
the One Punch Man.
What?
I don't think My Hero Academia is a very good example of anything.
I know you don't, but they do have registered superheroes and unregistered superheroes in the Vigilante series, which is great. Oh,
the Tick also has Aegis. So
now I was intentionally hoping, you see, to have a slideshow to talk through these different iterations of registered heroes as individual themes, rather than just scatter fire of them all, scattershot the thing. But guess who didn't get his thing finished? It was me.
Well.
In fact, I didn't get it started.
See, I was hoping to blame Twitless, who Honestly, actually carries the show half the time. But
Oh, you're right. As far as anything that looks like presentable, I mean, I'm totally off the cuff with almost everything I do. He comes prepared to present. So that's one of the things. It's that's the thing. I have never seen the guys in the chat are talking about this Tiger and Bunny show, but I've never even seen that, so I don't have the faintest idea.
Highly recommend it.
Let's first of all let's go ahead and let's talk about the Tick. Since we talked about that one, the Tick has registered heroes. People have to apply for their hero license on both the animated series and on the first live action series. I don't know that I've read about that in the comics, in the ones that I have read. I haven't read all of them.
The later live action series also had ages, and there was a registration process and stuff like that. But you could still, like in the other stuff, be a vigilante. You were just running a lot of risks not being registered.
Right. You didn't have any insurance coverage. You didn't necessarily have the color of law on your side. You could be held responsible for, breaking a bus by standing in the road, kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that's a valid consideration. But they do have you just have the unlicensed heroes as well that pop up within there, and of course, the other thing is the Tick is supposed to pastiche. It's supposed to be kind of a joke on all that kind of stuff. So maybe can't take that 100% seriously, right?
Yeah, but it's a very witty joke, so it kind of falls into that area of satire where it's like it's doing it as a joke because in some ways it's doing it better than the things it's making fun of.
Yes.
We kind of do the same thing in Sporkman. If you guys remember, those who have read the first issue of Sporkman, we actually have an agency called the League of Department of Unusual Humans. So we do actually have a registration team. While they do superhero exchange programs, it's still really the same thing. It's to play on that whole aspect, of doing the superhero registration.
Yep. And so, but with it, it's definitely with the Tick. It's specifically played for laughs, and of course, in Sporkman, when so much of that, you guys, I think one of the fun things I love about Sporkman. It's true in the Tick too, but not in the same flavor. Where it's serious and a joke at the same time. Yeah. So you get that. There's all these jokes, but it's very much in the spirit of the '66 Batman, where if you're 10, it's the most serious show you've ever seen, and by the time you're 15, it's lame, and then by the time you're 18, it's hilarious. So, so being able to appreciate that.
And by the time you're 45, it's cool.
Oh man, yeah.
My story was a little different. When I was 12, it was cool, and then I looked back again at like 35 and realized it was lame.
See, I've never felt that it was lame.
Oh, dude, I've always liked it.
Even when I was 12 and I knew that it was a joke, and I saw it when I was very small and it was all action, and when I saw it at 14, I was like, no, the action's silly, but it's still really fun. It's still. I mean, yeah, the giant, the Catwoman, trying to pour a tub full of acid all over Batman, or the coffee pot full of acid over Batman. Yeah, it's not really as scary as you think it would be, but that's okay. I'll suspend my disbelief to appreciate the escape, and I'll suspend my disbelief and I'll reinstall my disbelief to appreciate the jokes. So
I think the advantage of seeing it much, much later is that I watched it with my dad, who was laughing at it the whole time. So because humor and laughter is a social thing, when you hear somebody else laughing at it, your brain picks like, oh, this is supposed to be funny. So I've always appreciated it from that kind of like humorous perspective.
Yeah, I think that's actually really interesting too. Chuck Dixon talks about that he was small when that was on the air, so he had just started reading Batman comics and reprints from the Golden Age stuff, and so he was very much in the seriousness of Batman. And then Batman's on TV, and he was old enough to see it's an obvious joke. He's like, well, that's not my Batman, and he just sort of checked out of the '60s Batman altogether. And
I'm kind of in the same boat with Dixon on that. I've never been a fan of '66 Batman. That's just me, you know. But that we do kind of parry that with Sporkman. You know, it is that whole aspect of the joke. You know,
yeah.
You know, but it's having fun. So.
Yeah, well, and Sporkman, I think the stakes. I think you do a better job of making the stakes seem higher than 66 Batman did in a lot of the episodes, where there's no way you believe that it's going to have a detrimental effect to anything. But
can we get like a canned laughter like effect for comics? Like, can we work that in? Maybe just have like laughs along the gutters or stuff when things are supposed to be funny.
I probably I'm
gonna start experimenting with this. I'm gonna fine tune it.
That sounds, especially if you have it shaped like a can.
Yeah.
That might be some
canned laughter in the gutters.
Yeah. So anyway,
I'll get the oohs and the ahs too. We're gonna start controlling your emotions as you read the comic by what's going on in the gutter.
This is amazing. The Rube Goldberg machine of death. Yeah, that was that show. Every episode of that show. So okay, we talked about the tick of not serious take on it at all. I want to go jump over and look at Marvel and not talk about Civil War. I want to go back and talk about the Mutant Registration Act, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because I think in a lot of ways that's the nonsensical beginning of this idea in the popular mind, I think. And nonsensical, I mean, because mutants with powers need to be registered in the Marvel universe. That's the claim. But everybody else with powers do not need to be registered.
Well, see, now this is where I have a problem with X-Men being in the Marvel universe at all, because after all this time, we have 1,000,001 superheroes who are all popular and famous, and everybody loves them. But for some reason, this one group of heroes over here, no, they're the dirty ones we have to stay away from, and you can't. And for most of them, you can't tell anything from them visually. If they were walking down the street, they look like any other person. So it's like, how are we supposed to know that apparently these guys get their powers from the X gene and that makes them scary, but these guys get their powers from radiation, so that makes them okay?
That's because Marvel's writers decided that they wanted to do a racism allegory without actually making it make sense.
And it's a cool idea, but don't put it in a superhero universe where everybody has powers.
Right. But we're accepting for the sake of the conversation the mild inconsistency.
So I think what we need to also keep in mind that the Mutant Registration Act also led to the incident from a mutant speedball who ended up destroying a town, which led to the Superhero Registration Act.
Yeah, except once again, I can't hardly even. This is one of my things. I can't believe I brought this up because I don't want to harp on it too much, but that whole first scene of that book is so terrible because every single character is written out of character and are the stupid versions of themselves. I mean,
yeah,
I was he had the mentality of a 13-year-old, but not like a 13-year-old who'd kill you. I mean,
and don't forget, he then later turned into an emo ranger.
If I may simplify this for you, just say every character is the Mark Millar, or that's right, apparently Mark Miller version of themselves.
Yeah.
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 And they have been since then.
I will.
Yeah.
I did read that first. God, it's so good where he goes from there. But that first issue is
Well, especially
so
like
good.
the big
guys.
Like one of the biggest things for me in that first issue was like because I come off of the Neymar run and how Namorita was in that run with Neymar, and then she's like involved with that whole situation with the town blowing up, and I'm thinking, what is this? It's characters. It's character assassination across the entire board, in my opinion.
I agree. But
well, and that's what happens when you.
We're not here to harp on that again for another 3 hours.
We did a whole show. It's and not everybody on the panel was on the show, and I'm not trying to say, well, you missed your chance, but man, it was a long show of me going through that book with everybody.
Anyhow, yeah,
it was
back to the Mutant Registration Act. As my point would be, I think part of the problem is, because it is an allegory for racism and stuff like that, but it was also like an allegory for like you said, gun control. I think why it wouldn't work in our world and why it worked in the Marvel universe is because in our world, guns are, there's not a national ban on guns in the United States, as an example. Now, each state has their rules, and I would think, like, in regards to the Mutant Registration Act, it kind of would fall into the same thing. Each state would have their individual controls, but you couldn't have, like, a major event where, like, all the you know what I mean? I guess that's the way I would see it. So in Marvel, it worked because it was already pretty much, there was, like, no really states in that Marvel universe per se. Even though they existed, like, I think the whole thing with
but
Marvel
everywhere was just New York.
You're right, yeah.
That's
So
how Marvel is. Everywhere's just New York City.
So, like, for me, like, Marvel, even though Pennsylvania kind of exists in that world, it doesn't. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, like you said,
just an extension of New York.
Yeah, or Canada.
From New York, they'd agree with you.
But I think already you're looking at, with Marvel, everything's already national or worldwide. So really, it would be.
But one of the things that comes to me that really bugs me about that particular concept is, like, the philosophic reason we have the First Amendment in this country, right? Not on purpose. We're trying really hard to not talk Civil War, but it's inevitable. But anyway, the philosophical reason we have the First Amendment is because we have the intrinsic right to defend ourselves from a tyrannic government.
Right.
You mean the Second Amendment?
That right to
both.
Oh yeah.
Well, both actually. I meant the Second Amendment, but both are true. But it's intrinsic, right? It's part of our being a human being. That's what a right is. And if somebody stifles your ability to do X, then they're stifling your ability to act as a fully integrated human being, right? So if you're born with superpowers, part of being your intrinsic self is that power, as long as you're not, reaching out and punching somebody else in the face, right? That whole thing.
So Reese, I'd like to bring up a point of topic here. Are you familiar with Black's Law Dictionary?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've not read it, but I've heard about it.
But you are familiar with it.
Yeah.
So Black's Law Dictionary is where the original definition for the militia, which is referred to in the Second Amendment, comes from. Let me just read that for you. The body of soldiers in the state enrolled in discipline, comma, but not engaged in actual service except in emergencies, comma, as distinguished from regular troops or a standing army. So, if this were real, you could argue the Mutant Registration Act and later the Superhero Registration Act are both explicit violations of the Second Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
I would agree.
That's what I'm saying.
I'm saying that why wasn't this a story in the Marvel Comics universe?
Because
that could have been an interesting story.
Because
Because
nobody at
Mark
Marvel
Miller is
Comics
British.
believes that you have the right to defend yourself in reality.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is, once again, a lot of the like stuff that we hold like in real life doesn't really exist in the Marvel universe. Like in terms of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms and stuff like that. I think a lot of that stuff is not like It's not that it's there; it's never mentioned.
Well, and it's the whole idea, like the idea of registering superheroes, right? Like posse comitatus exists because every like adult male who can vote has the responsibility when called upon to defend the laws of defend other people even at your own peril, right? That's why that concept even exists, because you have the duty to do what you can to defend justice and to defend your fellow citizens. So even to say, oh, you have to be registered to do that, well, no, you're a voting citizen. You better be out there, punching monsters in the mouth and keeping them away from grannies and babies. That's
right.
He does have a point though, in that in a superhero, like, have you ever thought, if I can throw fire from my hands, does that nullify me from being able to use a gun?
No.
Like, isn't a gun perhaps even a better weapon than me throwing fire from my hands?
It would depend. Right? I think it would depend upon the nature of your powers. But on the general rule, right, Johnny Storm style, flame off is an option, then absolutely wouldn't stop you from it.
Right.
But if your hands are constantly on fire,
on top of that,
you might not be able to operate a gun properly.
Maybe it might be a good idea to go into battle with, say, a bulletproof vest on, some, I don't know, elbow pads, etc., right? But in a superhero universe, you're often trying to get this idea of, like, here's this character and here's their entire identity wrapped up in their superpowers. I think we often do have to sacrifice some reality for the sake of style, and as a result, I think it's very easy to see that the superheroes have to be the ones always saving the day, which means the average person has to be completely pathetic and incapable of doing anything to protect themselves or anybody else, right?
Right. Or the other, part of the conceit with that is that, like, in the Marvel universe, you've got the class of superheroes, and they are in combat with a class of super villains. The regular run-of-the-mill, even SWAT cops aren't prepared to deal with the Green Goblin. They can try, but they don't have the goods, right?
And I think a good example of that is Spider-Man. Use how he is with the local police and stuff like that in New York. Like, they rely on him to fight those villains most of the time. And they will defer most of that stuff. Anytime a superhero villain comes in, they defer it to him to do the stuff.
Right. And even though, again, if somebody came in and was throwing fireballs at people, would it not be a good idea to draw that gun and try to take care of them, right?
And they do. Yeah, they do. Yeah.
Well, and that's like even in the times when Spider-Man's been on the run from the law, the idea that it's believed or he's under suspicion of being a criminal, so they're actually would try to use their means to get him, but he's got crazy evasion powers.
But like, nothing was more disappointing to me than at the end of Into the Spider-Verse, when here they are, in the moment at which the bad guy's got to go down in that one moment of victory, and his dad, who is a cop, was right there like 30 seconds ago, and they so easily could have had him come back and save his own son, not even knowing who he was. That would have been like the most amazing twist. But you can't do that. You got to have the superhero be the one. You can't have the darn cop actually use his weapon to take care of this guy who's literally just a mastermind and nothing else. Okay, he's got some strength, but whatever. They had to specifically focus on the fight between the superhero and the supervillain and nothing else.
See, you got a problem with that example, Cartoonicus, because I never saw that movie. I have no idea what you're talking about. I had already given up on Hollywood by then, so I have no idea what you're talking about.
Ladies and gentlemen, the only person in the world who hasn't seen that movie.
If we're talking about Into the Spider-Verse, I also have not seen that movie.
Really?
I saw the trailer, and the animation was too janky, and I didn't want to watch it.
See, we're in an elite club of true spider enjoyers.
So I think if we would go, I think that if you gone back to the the Mutant Registration Act, I think that's why you summed up why Xavier fought the way he did. He never bought into the mutants being registered and stuff like that, and he fought on the side of freedom because he suffered through the concentration camp. Or not him, but he saw Magneto being suffering through the thing, and he knew that he did not want the mutants to suffer through the same thing, repeating that history again, and which is why he felt that. I firmly believe that, I think you would have a very hard time in our modern society if we had everybody had mutant powers or something like that, or let's say a 50% had mutant powers. I think you'd have a really hard time passing a Mutant Registration Act.
Yeah, I definitely. I think it depends upon the idea of the other being factor, and also the idea that being other means that there's an intrinsic lack of control, and that's once again that gets back to the gun debate. People that very much believe that the average Joe shouldn't have guns just simply believes the average Joe is incapable of care and conscience.
Well, I think it also comes down to, which is common with the people who write this stuff, a misunderstanding on a fundamental level of reality and how things work in the real world, right? Because there are registrations, there are registries. You just don't have to register. The difference is compliance and what power a registry has, right? So anytime we talk about public registries, that's something where you have to be compliant and it gives them a certain level of control over things. Like if it's a gun registry, that's which guns you actually can have and who can have them. While on the other hand, there are shadow registries where they are keeping track of everybody that they can, that aren't going in backwater ways of doing things. In the real world, if you had mutants running around, the government would be keeping track of as many mutants as they can. There's just, without a public registry, without a form of compliance, there isn't necessarily any law they can do to impose certain things like that. And that's where the Second Amendment comes in hand.
And looking at it from a HIPAA perspective, right? If you're a mutant, you have a divergent biologic makeup.
Yeah,
you're gonna be registered, just like people that have you go in when you're a kid, you get your blood work done, you find out whether or not you're Rh positive. It's like if there's an accident, they know where they can get blood for you. It may be buried under HIPAA compliance as far as who all has access to it, but it exists. And in a world where people are born with powers, whether they're mutants or whether they're whatever, there's gonna be a record of some of that stuff.
It's like
looking at guns,
like sex offenders too. Like they know where all of them are. They have maps and stuff where they can track them. There's a limitation of what they can do to limit their movement and stuff, but at least they know where they are, right? It'd be the same thing if you had mutants; they would have maps of where all of the people are, to some degree.
When you bring up HIPAA and we start getting away from the gun control thing, the idea becomes even stupider. So let's say that we have a distinctive group of people that lives within a single country that has superpowers, which is very useful for national security purposes. Do you want to encourage those people to leave, go to another country? Because if you want to do that, what you do is you make a regressive registration system, and I don't know, maybe make a giant assembly line of massive robots to hunt them down.
I have two opposing thoughts about this. Because one is the idea that, as far back as heroes go, the second you know that superhumans exist of any sort, any government in the world is going to want to use them for military purposes, any number of other things, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, Marvel then comes out with all this extra information about how heroes go way back hundreds and then even thousands of years, and they've been doing all kinds of stuff ever since, right? Which means the second anybody ever had power way back in days of old, it would have been those people with power who became the government. This universe
100%.
should not look anything like the universe we know whatsoever,
Right.
because all of history would have been changed.
Right.
Well, especially if you look at Sinister or Apocalypse. I mean, Apocalypse has been around since since the early Egyptian age.
Right, and they would have made themselves gods, just like he does.
Yeah.
All of religions around the world would have been changed. I mean, literally nothing we know would be anything we know.
Or they were mostly the same, and that's where the religions came from. And they were so competitive that most of them snuffed themselves out, and every few generations it restarts.
Point is, there's usually a reason why superheroes whenever they get adapted to film or something, they suddenly show up right here in modern day, and now we have to deal with them. But in these universes where they're actually trying to go way back, you have a major problem of actually trying to portray a modern, normal universe the way we know it, and assume that any of this could have happened.
Yeah, I do agree. There is some world building problems that are intrinsic to that, and actually, one thing Jim Tuner's pointing out to discuss that very thing was that that's another modern Marvel invention. Modern being back to the late '80s, but still, originally mutants emerged after the appearance of nuclear weapons, hence children of the atom.
Yep.
And
yeah,
I
mean that's a Kush Claremont. That was one of the big things he kind of retconned. It wasn't how they got activated was the nuclear weapons or the nuclear stuff activated the X gene, and stuff like that. Whereas he turned it now more to be genetically, they were when the evolutionary did everything. He's the one that changed the X gene and caused the mutations to start. So
and
definitely
said the Celestials put the X gene in there.
Yeah.
There's definitely some lore problems that arise because of all of that. But that's not the point of the conversation.
Yeah. We're trying to look more like the practical and legal side of things.
The reason I bring it up, though, is because you're talking in any of these situations, you're talking about the government contending with superheroes when it's very likely that the government and the superheroes would really be synonymous.
Right. Like in the Blade film, where they have the vampires really are running things.
Yeah.
It's a shadow government.
You would have powers that are contending with each other. Some of them are organized, some of them are tyrannical, some of them are disorganized, and some of them would be in the opposite end of the spectrum, like on the libertarian side. This is all of history, is powers clashing with each other. So not like the government would have powers on their side, but that wouldn't be where all the power is.
Right. And so when we were working on our Ideal Comics universe, the way we specifically designed the universe was that the humankind originally, in its original state, was superpowered. And so the heroic age of the gods and demigods from the ancient past, they were all superpowered beings. And as society split apart from each other, and as they isolated apart from each other, and races started dividing themselves and separating across the planet, those powers faded in the gene line. And so then in the age of exploration and discovery, and here in America, where everybody's a melting pot again, we're putting our genes back together. And so the emergence of superpowers happens here in America, because that's where everybody's putting they're recombining all of our genetic stock again. So that was, we intentionally did it that way. I mean, granted, if you look at genetic history, we've all been way more mixed than that throughout the centuries, and it doesn't really work. But I got flying people, guys. Come on.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're making up genetics anyway.
Yeah.
Marvel didn't do any better by making up the X gene.
I got a half demon that hangs out with a dude and plays video games all day. Come on, let me have this.
Whereas in our universe, we have very little powered people. Mostly everybody that's a superhero are more techie people and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, we got to try to bring it back here to the Registration Act. Here's the other question, though. I think where you would be able to enact it is, would we see if somebody had powers? Okay, would we automatically intrinsically think that person is evil?
Because that's a really complicated proposition.
Which universe are we talking about? One where those those people with power are gods and you bow down to them, or one where they suddenly appeared in the 1950s?
In Marvel 616, I think because we need to limit on here. In the Marvel 616, the first emergence of powers in the public consciousness, right, was in that pre-war World War II period, and you had Namor, dude with powers, alien. I mean, utter sea invasion, drowns New York. That guy's a villain. You've got the Human Torch. Totally, he's a freak, but everyone loves him because
he's an android.
Because he keeps saving the day, right? So nobody likes him, but everybody likes him, right? So he's got that whole thing. And then you have Captain America, big PR move, everyone loves him. So you have these kind of things where so much of the superpoweredness that exists is heroes and a couple of villains, but a lot of the heroes, I think that in the Marvel universe, they'd be more inclined to take Busiek's take from Marvel's, where it's terrifying for your Joe Square, but they're also on the sides of the heroes, and they believe in the heroes. And so I think that's going to be a more likely take in the Marvel universe than just to assume that powers means bad there. So that would be my take on the Marvel universe. What do we want to think before we move on to the superhero?
Well, I think Marvel, it's more that just powers mean danger, right? But danger could be good, right? Like fire can be good, but inherently powers is danger. It's like the Incredible Hulk. He saves people, but he's in danger anywhere he goes.
But I want to point out to another part of how our actual reality worked. There was a little guy, you might have heard of him. He was a painter in Austria, and he took over a country. You might have heard of it called Germany. And he had this solution for how he wanted to deal with people. Now, what many people learn incorrectly in history class is that people just, rolled over and took it. But in actuality, there were active protests of Hitler's program going on until the war started in earnest. So the problem with the Mutant and Superhero Registration Act is average citizens just took it for some reason, even though that's literally not what happened in the case of the Soviet Union, Mao's China, Nazi Germany. People wouldn't stand for this sort of behavior.
Yeah. Well, that comes down to, that would once again, in terms of playing that out in a story dynamic, that would be who has the most powers or the most, Sentinel robots.
Yeah.
So, well, based on what you're saying, though, then that would actually open up the doors quite a bit for a much more underground, deep state-like scenario where, the powers that be are much more silent and they are going to simply manipulate things into the way they want it to be.
Yeah. But let's table that for just a second. I want to because honestly, I think that ties really well into some other universes and how they played with it. But before we get into that, I want to talk about the superhero registration stuff. And Fizz in the chat had some great comments on the superhero registration specifically. He said, not to mention the Superhero Registration Act wouldn't work to stop supervillains, as criminals wouldn't reveal their information to the government, except the ones that had already been caught, perhaps. But not to mention, many powered beings in the Marvel Universe get their powers well after being born. How does the government monitor them? So if you've got somebody who builds them, like Tony Stark built the Iron Man suit and lied for, 10 years about being Iron Man, right? And nobody could call him on it because, his tech was impregnable. So I think that's a really valid point. So,
I think
Well, you have an issue with S.H.I.E.L.D. because S.H.I.E.L.D. knows who all these people are, whether they've personally contacted them or not. They can triangulate, right? This is the issue with real life, and this is how they track people, is if you get a sighting of somebody here, a sighting of somebody there, a sighting of somebody there, and they're in a locale, they do things. It's not that hard for a detective to pull hundreds of instances of something and figure out who somebody is. This is how we track serial killers over long periods of time, and very few of them get away. There's some notable ones, but very few go completely undetected once there's been enough sightings of them.
I realized this about Batman years ago, and superheroes admittedly do work a whole lot better the farther back in time you go, and the less technology you have to deal with.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually in our universe, we've got a set of characters who specifically have technology that is there to nullify the observation satellites and seeing cameras for that very reason.
Well, I mean, you would have to come back to is with our modern culture the way it is, our
God damn,
I love that.
what?
I love that.
What?
Okay, according to the law of superheroes, registration could be legislated through the Commerce Clause.
Everything is registered through the. Oh my god!
Well, that would be executive order. So here's a good question. So, could a president literally create a registration act through an executive order?
I honestly think that you could get one started, if it wasn't okay. So, like, one of the big comparisons that Civil War forces us to draw a comparison to is the idea that guns equals terrorism equals supervillain, right?
Right.
So, with that, the idea that simply having powers makes you an automatic danger, right? But in the real world, your right to self-defense through the Second Amendment is there in here in America, and so we would have we'd say, well, right to self-defense is rooted in our idea that we have a right to our life and our liberty, and so but we have a legal precedent, which is why we keep having this conversation with people that don't necessarily see the Second Amendment that way. So, so because of that, we have this idea of this conflict between we have this right, but maybe we don't have this right. There is no legislation in the Marvel universe that says you have a right to, the body you were born in, right? And so because if there's no if there says there's no right to be born a mutant or to be bitten by a radioactive spider or to get knocked in the head with radioactive ooze and turn into Daredevil, then because there's no protected right, nothing written, no thing on that, then you wouldn't have the same recourse that you have when people say, "Oh, we should take your guns." 2A. The Commerce Clause just says that the Congress has the right to make commerce regular in the various states, right?
Yeah, but it's led to a lot of different things.
Well, I know.
Twitless was making an Obamacare joke. That was what Twitless was going for.
Twitless is making
but it does extend.
Because,
right?
it's like tons of stuff.
Because there's the Gun-Free School Zones Act, which the jurisprudence comes under the Commerce Clause, right?
Which is
so
stupid.
You could argue, but because of the stupid way the law is, you could argue that people like mutants or heroes and stuff could be legally banned from school grounds, right?
But
which wouldn't stop a villain. This would be bad.
That would have to. You at that point you'd be running into the friggin' Northwest Ordinance, and we don't even need to talk about that tonight.
Yeah.
So,
but I do want to go back to what you said about right to the body you're born in. Except that's actually in existing case law. It's why homeless people and people with extreme mental illnesses don't have to medicate unless they present a danger to themselves or others. So you would need a court to adjudicate that somebody with superpowers is a sufficient risk to public harm before you could force them to register or be regulated in such a manner.
So one of the situation that comes into play with Twitless is actually in the back room.
What's up?
Welcome. The situation that actually comes into play is that the Commerce Clause, while it has been wildly misconstrued and misused for stuff, it still gives the Congress and executive authority certain powers or the color of law. And you can enact a lot of policies through executive order with that a justification that may or may not hold up in court, but it's got to make it to a court before that can be discussed. Right. And so you could pull a quickie on people based on public opinion after something.
If I could, there's actually two. Yeah, and again, I'm not saying to what degree I might agree with this or not, but there's a really great book called The Law of Superheroes by James Daly and Ryan Davidson, and it's endorsed by Popat, who even Nick Rekieta will defer to. But
that shouldn't be a very high bar, really.
I'm just saying.
Pope Pat used to be a lot more credible of a legal commentator. He's declined in his skills recently, but
I don't even know who Pope Pat is.
He's a big like a law commentator, and he apparently a lot of his takes are like really solid. So according to this book, and I just wanted to kind of cite a couple of just for for the benefit of the audience and panel of what this book kind of cites as what could be used. So there were two examples. One of them was the Keene Act from Watchmen, and the second one is the superhero registration. Both of them were cited as potentially being able to. So basically, what happens is like in the book they said, okay, here's what happened in the comics. Here's the closest that we have in law to try and maybe address how this could actually happen. And so the closest they had, there were two things, and one of them was, of course, the Commerce Clause. And they said that it was here. Let me quote a couple passages. Specifically, there is an interstate market for crime prevention and investigation services, like private security firms, private investigators, and bounty hunters. Firms and individuals involved in this market routinely work across state lines. The Keene Act could require, for example, that anyone working in such a market do so under his or her real identity. The legitimate government interest would be the safety of consumers of such services. It is important for consumers of such services to know whom they are dealing with. The fact that costume adventurers sometimes provide their services for free and often without contracting with clients is of no account, as is the fact that they may work with only within one state. The Commerce Clause extends to non-commercial transactions and even intrastate activities, as long as doing so is necessary to make the interstate regulation effective. And they also cite the fact that there is real-life precedent, I think recent precedent, that wearing a mask, you don't necessarily have a right to wear a mask at a protest. So the Second Circuit, including now Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor, which I know no one's a fan of, noted that Supreme Court has never held that the right to engage in anonymous speech entails a right to conceal one's appearance in a public demonstration, nor has any circuit found such a right. A court could find that costume adventuring is similar to a public demonstration, and so there is no right to anonymous crime fighting. So that's one half of that. And I've just briefly touch really fast on the Superhero Registration Act was mentioned as a potential precedent was actually drafting. So how Congress is able to draft and essentially override most of your civil rights in order to raise an army, in order to raise protection for the state. And so if we're dealing with a world where superheroes are in case real, the closest analog precedent that this book cites is that conscription could in fact be the ticket. And so the sticky wicket there was essentially if you were targeting specific people to draft, like I want to draft Superman, as opposed to just drafting all males, 18 and above, or between 18 and 30, whatever. So essentially this was the other potential way to basically get registration to occur. Now, if you get past those two, if you get it passed, then essentially you're left with, well, how is it then administered? And then you're left with like how the executive branch sets up all the, post New Deal agencies. And then you'd have like SHIELD or something adjudicating it more than likely. But those were the two precedents that were brought up by lawyers as this is the closest to how it would probably work out in law, either Commerce Clause with these specific instances or specific justifications in mind, or conscription.
Yeah.
And there were some anti-vigilante acts that came in the late 19th century that I think are still on the books.
Yeah,
actually
it was those were specifically geared at abolishing the KKK, but
well, was it? Well, here's the thing. There was recently that guy who was a superhero who dressed as a superhero, and he went out, and they ended up arresting him because he was acting as they deemed him as a vigilante, even though he was doing
Phoenix Jones, I think was his name.
Yeah,
the dude in Seattle, the MMA guy.
Yeah, and even though he was doing good, he did break some people's bones or something like that. They ultimately ruled he was a vigilante, not working within the confines of the law.
But here's the difference. Vigilante registration versus you have powers. Therefore, we're going to assume that you may or may not do something in the future. Registration.
So I want to address.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to talk about the draft. There was something I wanted to talk about earlier. Twitless pulls it up because you could, as long as it's a blanket law, right? As long as it applies to people equally, you can make it something simple like if you can put out more than this amount of force with your body, it would be the same as like, well, if you are male and above this age, you could be drafted. As long
Selective
as it's
service.
as long as it's uniformly applied to people across the board, you could actually put something like that.
It would be
and that's what I wanted
easy.
to come down to compliance, right? And this is what I was talking about before.
Yeah. All you'd have to do is you would just simply have to administer a fitness test, and it would simply be all people who basically perform at this level get conscripted into the United States military.
And it could be in reserve. You don't actually have to be active. You could be military reserve conscripted in, which is a way they would be able to handle this in that way. And you could just basically be sent out whenever they want to use you.
Okay, so this is a fascinating idea, actually, because, again, it changes all of history. You know they would have been drafted into World War II, right?
Okay, so now that you bring that up, there's an excellent series. I recommend everyone read it. It's called Uber by Kieran Gillian. And although it ends, it actually hasn't technically ended, and it kind of falls off a little bit towards the end.
I was going to say Uber, yes.
Uber by Kieran Gillian exactly addresses what would happen in a World War II setting if you had people with superpowers and how they would be tactically deployed, what battles would be won, which battles would change. And it's very well written. It's really,
also how
really good.
They made how they were trying to manufacture heroes also on top of it.
True.
Yeah, they've got a.
But here's
DC
what happens
did that
after,
whole thing in the JSA Classified miniseries too.
Here's the thing. Here's what happens afterward, because this is still a problem today. It was really a problem after World War II. Is that all these guys came back from the war and they had no jobs. They had been drafted as kids with no skills except for what they learned in the military, or the women had taken all their jobs during the war, right? And now there was like a big clash, and you had a lot of people out of work, trying to figure out what, I was in charge of multi-million-dollar equipment over there, and here I'm practically homeless. In this scenario, you have to assume a lot of people would probably become some type of paid vigilante using the one thing they've got, and that's their powers.
Well, and I mean, and to bring that around, the numbers of people that fall into that exact wheelhouse were actually pretty small, because tons of women left the workforce after the war, like in droves. But you did have, I mean, the Hells Angels and the other motorcycle gang came to exist because of people that didn't feel like they could fit into square society anymore. So there's definitely some of that. But it's much smaller than a lot of people talk about. There's a propaganda point about that. But
there was that one in Georgia where the veterans overthrew their local government because their local government was corrupt. So that would be another consequence of a bunch of superpowered people being demilitarized and going back into straight society.
Well, also, it's compliance at the end of the day, right? So they could put out whatever rule they want as long as it falls within, like, we can conscript you. And then it comes down to whether people are actually compliant. This would have been the more interesting thing to do with the Civil War movie, because I think it almost handled it as an idea better than the comic did with the Accords. But instead, it didn't come down to compliance, because nobody actually had to agree to it for it to pass. It would have just passed and be like, well, you're in here, so you either comply or you don't. When it comes to the draft, like, you can dodge the draft. You can also not sign up for it, and there are penalties to it, but they are fixed penalties. They can't actually punish you indefinitely. They have their options of what they can do. They can hold you for a long time. They can put you in jail for so many years. They can put you in jail for the length of the time that you have to serve a military service if they want. But they can't actually just punish you indefinitely for something like that. There are regulations against that they would have to overturn a lot of how the Constitution works if they wanted to change that. So there could be people who were basically draft dodgers that live out there. So the power still wouldn't be uniformly in the government's favor just because there are powerful people in the world, even with those laws. You could still have stories that are interesting with people that don't comply. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to compliance is the main subject when it comes to law.
And it still gets away from, I mean, all of this, and still doesn't address the fact that it's a betrayal of the concept of the superhero. You have a world
just want to comply
into place, and suddenly it stops being a world of superheroes and starts being a world of contracted law enforcement officials.
Well, and also,
Well,
like,
I think
how do you
there's-
force some superheroes to comply? You know,
Yeah.
But again, I feel like there would
with other
already
superheroes,
be
that's going to be
a
a
whole
mess.
bunch of people who would not be just honorably going out there and fighting crime. They would want to put their powers to use for themselves, but they'd still want to do it legally. And they'd find a way basically to turn it into a business. And somewhere in there, you know that government agencies, law enforcement, etc., are going to be like, "Hey,
Yeah.
you
I mean, insurance companies, if nothing else,
yeah,
you'd have to be insured and bonded to have a superhero agency.
Which is
Well,
also why I think
I
Aegis is the
think
best
if you
example.
look, I was going to say, if you look at the Superhero Registration Act, I think the very point in contest, you had that perfect dichotomy between Iron Man and Captain America, and in between you were Spider-Man. You know what I mean? Because Spider-Man was the one who was struggling with this. Does he side with Iron Man or does he side with Captain America? Who's right and who's wrong? You're meant to be Spider-Man. I think that, and that's the whole thing is, where do you think? Do you think Captain America is more right, or do you think Iron Man was more correct?
That's one of the other problems I have with that story is that Peter never would have sided with Iron Man.
Oh, I agree.
100%. He's 100% a non-joiner. Peter
So if
looks
you-
out for Peter and his own. That's
if
it.
you read, I think it makes more sense, and I'm not defending it too much, but I will say that it's one of those cases, and this is indicative of one of the problems that Marvel has run into with all of its crossovers. Is like, well, actually, if you read all of the issues of this storyline that you might not have read, the lead into Parker accepting was the fact that he had already kind of moved Aunt May and MJ into Tony's compound. It was already working for him. And under those circumstances, and it kind of makes sense. It made sense. It made sense for Peter to do, because it was like, hey, you're rich. I'm working for you. This makes sense for my family, and it'll keep them really safe. So like him kind of being like led down the garden path by Tony made sense if you were reading more of the storyline that led into it. If it's cold out of the blue, I agree. But like in the storyline where Peter was at the time, it made more sense. But that assumes that everybody is reading every single tie-in line into the crossover, which has been one of the big problems with the crossovers for years, is that it's like, if I'm just reading the main book and I'm not reading these issues of Iron Man, these issues of Spider-Man, these issues of Captain America, these issues of Fantastic Four, all of which don't necessarily, they sometimes have contradictory information. I found contradictory information in the Spider-Man line and the Iron Man line when you compare them side by side.
Well, this is also what happens when you have dozens of writers writing something over 80, 90 years.
It's mostly down to it's down to bad editing. The editors,
that was what I was about to say. If only there was a person whose job it was to keep the continuity of his story together, like a continuity editor.
It was the editor's fault.
Before we get on that too much. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, like, I think the whole, like, for me, I think one of the whole dichotomies for Peter was what led him to do this. Keep in mind, from that line, Aunt May had just been shot by, and targeted by, I believe, this is because the other leads into the whole Civil War series.
No, that's the shooting happens after. The shooting happens afterwards.
It's
down that path.
I thought it was before. I thought the other was...
Kingpin contracts
that was the fallout.
shooting. It's the fallout. That's why he knows.
Okay.
Yeah, that's another reason to hate Civil War. It led to one more day.
So,
yes, of course.
We talked about that. That was on our list.
We vigorously litigated that comics.
Oh yeah, it was brutal. It was violent. You should go back and watch it. And it was funny because in my passionate hatred of that story, Twitless had to go about and defend it, and it was sort of funny. Which I appreciate that, by the way. I love playing devil's advocate. It's my favorite job.
Here's a question.
One of the things I want to get back to, though, before we get too far, Jim Tuner had a couple of comments I wanted to go ahead and address.
Yeah.
One is that you can't apply the Commerce individuals in that way, and we kind of talked about that. But the other thing
there are some lawyers who think you can. So
they have. They have. That is how Obama care survive the Supreme Court. Was you can. They just decided it was a tax, and boom, you can use the Commerce Clause.
Yeah,
Whether or not you should is a different argument.
Yeah,
I'm
and
just saying that
whether
you
that's
can get
actually
away with
just
it.
reasoning, that's fine. But go take it up with Justice Roberts.
It's
not my problem.
It's also similar to the reasoning that Justice Scalia used to justify why you should make marijuana illegal within one state if it's produced and sold only within one state. And the state says, no, bro, it's totally legal here.
So another thing he points out is the closest we have in history is the Japanese internment in World War II, which was accomplished through an executive order. And I definitely can see there are some parallels in that, but an executive order has got plenty of power to get a ball started. And once you start an executive agency, it's the Department of Education for 50 years to making our kids stupid. So
yeah.
And
now, if you're like a Navajo that has powers and you never leave the reservation, that's entirely the jurisdiction of the tribe.
Yeah. Well,
now the example of Japanese internment
it is, but
it is, and it isn't.
Oh,
yeah.
now we get into Genesis.
But it's hard to enforce it. Like even
it is harder to
with
enforce
it, yeah.
because they intentionally stay so rural, and that's part of the power of their governance.
That'd be a fun superhero.
But the whole point of the Japanese internment, the reason that they were able to do that with an executive order is because they declared war. Because the federal government has broader powers when a war is declared versus a police action.
Yes, that's true, but the executive orders are still crazy powerful.
But they could. Here's the flip side. You could, let's say, you have it where the superhero and supervillain are fighting and they cause damage, like i.e. that happened up in Connecticut with that triggered the whole Superhero Registration Act. What if the government decides, hey, that's affecting people? They're warring against each other. It's no longer just a normal conflict. Innocent people are being injured. Therefore, they can say, you need to register, or you need to go into an internment camp, or whatever.
Within the universe.
So I feel like the closer analog to that is essentially every act of supervillainy is an act of domestic terrorism. All of that is Department of Homeland Security and Guantanamo Bay. So,
which is what they did in
Fly Fox Pro is here. Got to say hello, Fly Fox Pro. Good to see you. And Neostar and
first of all, I want to take that time since we're stopping it anyway. I want to send out congratulations to Fly Fox Pro and the whole all those guys over at Graveyard Press. They funded Lone Wolf 2 today in 7 minutes.
Nice.
I haven't had a chance to put mine down. I can't even wave the flag. But way to go with all you guys over there. Big round of applause from Nebraska. I'm excited to see that book.
Woohoo! Congrats.
Yeah. So sorry to totally step all over top of you there, man. But
we got to acknowledge chat. That's what we're here for them.
What were we talking about?
Yeah, I know.
We were talking about Fly Fox being here, and I wanted to go ahead and make the announcement. So
we were talking about superheroes and supervillain actions being classified as acts of domestic terrorism, therefore falling under the Department of Homeland Security's purview.
How long has that actually existed? I mean, didn't the Department of Homeland Security only exist after 9/11?
Yes.
So they've only got so much time to work with that.
But the federal government has tried to create it since the 70s.
Basically.
So all you need is some big event to happen.
Exactly.
An accident.
Yeah.
like
Doomsday walking through and trashing Metropolis, or Cyborg Superman destroing Coast City.
And the question becomes with it is and one of the things Marvel addressed this questions back in the 80s and 90s in other books, but the solution had always been prior to that private sector solutions, right? So and I'm going to forget the name of the company that contracted with the government. Damage Control. But it was private contractors that were taking care of all of this stuff, and Stark Enterprises was taking care of stuff like that too. So you had private sector that was in there doing all of the things. There's no within the Marvel universe, there wasn't a need for massive government oversight because there were already laws on the books about fighting in public, and there was already laws in the books that acknowledged the expressly allowed the existence of superheroes, and there were private sector solutions for taking care of damages, and there would have been the massive insurance substructure and all that other kind of stuff that was just applied. and we just said,
Mhm.
"Ta-da!"
And in the Marvel universe, New York City had a perpetual disaster, federal disaster status due
Yes,
to all the superhero battles and space alien invasions and all that
dating
stuff.
back to 41 when Namor invaded. So
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
so that was one of those things where like there was already private sector and cross sector solutions for all of these problems. So that's the other thing where it's like when they put in the Superhero Registration Act, my brain is just like, oh my goodness. I also felt the same way when we in the real world got the Department of Homeland Security, because people were already doing that job to begin with.
And that's where again I get back to don't ever underestimate what certain people far behind the scenes will be trying to get done for their own purposes.
It
Yeah.
actually reminds me of something. He's not actually as a superhero, but it kind of falls in that category. I don't know if any of you guys have seen Trigun, Ryan.
Yes.
But Vash the Stampede is a wanted man. He's the humanoid typhoon. He causes disaster everywhere he goes, not necessarily on purpose. It just happens around him because of who he is. And he has a huge bounty on his head that people want to claim, and they send people after him. And when you actually finally find out at like the end of the first episode who sent the bounty, it's the insurance agency sent some people to go pick him up, and there's like this huge like billion double dollar, which is just supposed to be yen, like a billion yen bounty on this single man who is helping people. He's basically a vigilante, but just because of so much destruction around him at all times, they have like almost an entire subsection of an insurance agency dedicated to him existing.
Yeah, people tell me I need to watch Trigun, but I haven't had a chance yet. So
You need your insurance clause to have or your insurance contract to have an Acts of Godzilla clause.
Yeah.
Well, don't forget. Also, you had the whole thing. Marvel or DC did the same thing too. And what was they did the TV show, of course, of it, which is nothing like. They actually had the insurance companies that handled all the damage stuff in their, in the universe and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So,
I was going to go to
an actual universe of where there's superheroes on every corner and probably superhero battles on every corner, that the insurance companies would learn to embrace that and become billionaires.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they did that in DC. They actually in DC they actually have a whole insurance company just for Superman.
Yeah.
Because the amount of damage he does. So
So
and they
DC
actually, and they played with that in Sean Gordon Murphy's White Knight.
White Knight.
Knight had the whole the fund. That's specifically there to fix stuff.
Pardon me. DC also did a whole mini series about there was a stand-in for the McCarthy hearings.
Well,
and
not really,
but kind of, sort of,
because they said that it was, but those weren't the McCarthy hearings. That was the HUAC hearings from a decade before that actually did find communists that Walt Disney was a testify and name names. So like the history's been severely muddled.
Walt's a true American.
As much as I love Roy Thomas, he totally boffed the historical ball in that story. But
I figure we should probably touch on that in connection to the whole superhero registration concept, because that was kind of a similar idea.
Well, and in DC, and I'm not sure how it stands in the current continuity, but in the pre-52 continuity, there was a spy agency that was established called was a law enforcement agency called the DEO, the Department of Extranormal Operations, and that was founded because it was originally found. It was a retcon, but the idea was it was originally founded because of the HUAC trials, and when the heroes stepped down and there weren't any superheroes for a while, and then there were U.S. super soldiers in play, and then there was the superheroes that reemerged, and all that kind of stuff. And so this law enforcement agency oversees super crime, right? But heroes aren't necessarily licensed in the DC universe, but they might be criminally liable if so that's the other kind of thing is so you see Superman going around and fixing the buildings that he breaks. So he's never doesn't run into that kind of problem. And Batman, somebody keeps paying for all the things he breaks.
Well, so here's the thing, and especially this goes when you have a secret identity. But even without that, when you have the powers of Superman, who exactly is going to enforce a law that says you're responsible?
Well, and that was the funny thing about the Superman character is that like Superman enforces it himself. That's who he is. Especially
he's self-complied. He's
proactively complying. I don't even know that he knows that's a law. He's just like, well, of course I'm going to fix Mrs. McGonagall's fence. I broke it.
That's part of her life.
There's apparently a story that's really. Let me find it. It was in this book, and it had to do with Superman versus the IRS. And so essentially, an IRS agent figures out that every single time that Superman captures a villain and collects a reward on it, and every time he crunches a diamond, every time he does any of those things, that's all income. And he hasn't been paying taxes on any of that income for years.
Well, now he's also not a citizen.
So suddenly Superman, this is a story. This was from Superman Owes $1 Billion, Superman Volume 1, 148 from 1961. And so apparently Superman's in a sticky wicket because suddenly he owes just way more money than he can realistically pay back. And so what he does is he claims the Earth as a dependent.
I love it.
That's awesome.
And that apparently zeroes the balance.
Again,
If anything, they probably owe him money.
Who does he owe taxes to? He doesn't belong to any country.
Truth, justice, in the American
Clark does.
way. So
on,
every
man.
time
You would have to tell them that you're Clark Kent.
So he owed, according to the IRS, every time he collected money for a bounty on a villain, and again crunching those diamonds from whatever, that was all income.
Cole.
So.
I would want to see that go down in a court of law and then try to actually prove.
No, see, Superman didn't challenge it. Like I said, that's the point.
Yeah,
He wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly.
He's like, oh no, I violated the tax law. How do I solve this problem?
It's with his newest power, guys. Super accounting.
Yes.
No.
Well,
what is
say he's always been accountable.
What it is, he talks to Batman about it and says, bro, I'm a multi-billionaire. Trust me, I could fix this problem for you.
Batman calls his accountant up and be like, hey.
No, he's probably just like, well, I've claimed Gotham as a dependent before. I'm sure you could probably widen the net further than that.
It's Bat-countant.
Oh.
So
that was terrible.
By the way, this book I'm talking about, The Law of Superheroes. If you want to do further reading, it's a fun read, and it touches on a lot of these interesting situations, and then ties in with like real. It tries to find the closest thing in real law that would apply in that situation, and gives you a little bit of a breakdown on it. It's a good read. I enjoyed it.
Okay. So have we beaten the horse that is the DC universe on superhero registration? Because I want
Marvel. You mean Marvel?
The originals. Well, we beat Marvel to death, but the original inspiration for DC that caused this show to exist was people saying, "What DC superheroes would be behind registration?" The answer is none of them.
None of them.
Yeah, I would agree.
Unless you character assassinate them like Marvel did the characters for Civil War.
Okay,
Well, I will push back.
Hold on.
I'm going to push back a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
So my point. Go ahead, Toitless.
No, I'm sorry. You go ahead.
I was going to say, I will push back on that. Superman did work for the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm.
Dark Knight.
I was going to say Injustice. If you take the type of Superman that's in Injustice or in Kingdom Come, as Reese cringes to his boots. If you take different Elseworlds Superman or certain other DC characters, like I said, Injustice, Kingdom Come, Dark Knight Returns, you actually do have certain DC superheroes essentially being on the side of essentially registration.
Here's the thing.
On the side of tyranny.
Aren't all of these like alternate variations on them?
And Chuck?
What's that?
Well, no, not all of them. I mean, because if I was talking with the DEO earlier, Bones, who's the head of the DEO, he's the big boss guy. He's 100% for registration. He just doesn't have the legal authority yet. So he's a reformed supervillain. So
I'm talking about when people talk though about things like
I'd put Guardian. Guardian would probably be more in favor. He works for Cadmus or whatever. So
I'm saying though, when you talk about things like Injustice or The Dark Knight, like these are Elseworld stories where they create a very different version.
Dark Knight is not. Dark Knight is actually technically in the mainstream DC universe.
Well, it is now, but I mean, the whole point of him doing that wasn't that it was basically.
I'm with Cartoonicus. It's typically an alternate take.
He was basically becoming a villain at that point by selling out to the government.
Selling it to Ronald Reagan.
He was a very different. Yeah, I know.
Specifically,
got a little
Ronald.
Political statement in there, didn't they? Right.
I think Neil brought up a really good point, guys. He says, "Hasn't anyone seen Justice League: New Frontier or read the books?"
I have not.
I read part one of the book. Yeah.
That deals with the whole registrating superhero. Superman was on the side of registration. Wonder Woman was not.
Mm-hmm.
So it is something that is addressed. So it's not just like a one and done. Like this is something that I would also say. I think the Justice League cartoons is quasi touches on this. This is the thing.
Back to my point in the beginning, one more time about having to sacrifice reality for the sake of spectacle. So many of these things, when they come up, only come up after decades and decades of telling stories, and we start looking around and going, "Wait a minute!"
I'll do you one better. Dwayne McDuffie, who is who I disagree with on politics, but he knew how to put together storylines really well or synthesize storylines really well. And in Justice League Unlimited, the setup they have for the Justice League is essentially a type of registration. Now it's opt-in, but there is a sort of like understood kind of like
you're in
if you're doing superpower things and you're not operating with like the league's like say so, like you're in some interesting territory.
It's a guild system.
It is. It's a guild system, but it's a kind of guild system where it's like Superman could show up and say, even if you weren't in the guild. And there is an episode where they actually kick out. I think is it Question and Huntress they kick out?
Yeah, probably.
So so some of these things, whether or not they're officially registered by the government or as was just brought up very, very well, very well put, a guild kind of, but I sort of, like I said, they didn't quite address how voluntary, like where those lines were, like where would Superman actually say, okay.
Right, and that's one of those things where with that circumstance, that's still looking at a private sector solution, right?
But there were some moments where when the league started to overstep its bounds, and it was like you're starting to act like a government, and that actually was brought up. I mean,
it would be natural.
A guild is
to have a private sector solution, right? Because a guild is like. It's a part of the government in a way, but it isn't, right?
Well,
it's government contract. It's what handles, right? Yeah, it handles contracts between people.
A guild, by definition, is a government. It's not the big G government, but
it's a governing body.
But Waller brings up the fact that because of its power, it's actually the most powerful government in the world.
Right.
And that creates a lot of problems for adjudicating things because
right now
Google
of the
power
is the most
dynamics.
powerful government in the world.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I said,
Google.
Right now, Google is the most powerful government in the world. So, what are you gonna do?
Neostar says, "Remember the episode?" Yes, I was just watching that clip. General Ealing becomes he basically becomes the Shaggy Man.
Oh yeah.
So that was their version of Shaggy Man. Yeah,
that was one of the only, and that was actually that was Grant Morrison's idea from the second arc of his Justice League series. And
oh my gosh, does that mean I like one idea that Grant had? Oh my gosh,
idea Grant Morrison
what the hell?
Hey, maybe LSD.
I know, I feel dirty.
Maybe LSD wasn't kicking in that day.
Yeah, good Lord.
Twitless is like, I'm not even Catholic, I'm going to confession.
Yeah.
I
have sinned. I liked an idea that Grant Morrison had.
I will say, coming back to in the DC universe, I do believe like Fizz Charles said, a DC universe the DC superheroes are scattered across the country, so it would be a lot harder in the DC universe to enact a superhero registry act. Like it was done in Marvel, I believe.
Yeah.
You know,
and that's one thing. Like Nebraska has like 3 or 4 superheroes, but like they're not governed in the state at all, because there's so little impact.
What about Wolverine? He's Canadian.
Well, he's not in the DC universe, is he?
I'm just.
Well, Wonder Woman is from another.
Yeah, I know.
Country,
Yeah, exactly.
and-
Well, yeah, and
we
they
have
actually addressed the
Superman,
Wonder
I guess,
Woman
is an
thing.
alien.
She's a
They've
foreign
addressed the Wonder
diplomat,
Woman thing
actually.
multiple times.
Yeah,
Wonder
that's
Woman's
true.
got a diplomatic
immunity.
Yep.
Just like Doctor Doom.
Would that
Yeah,
have actually happened?
She is a princess
when she killed Max Lord, they wanted her to go to jail for the death of Max Lord, but because she had diplomatic immunity, she got away with it.
Can we
That's
say
not exactly how diplomatic immunity works, though.
I hate
Does
this moment.
I know, but that's the excuse they used. You know what I mean? It's lazy writing, you know. But
Diplomatic immunity works is if you're a diplomat and you murder someone, our government says you leave now.
Yes.
You've lost your privileges to be here.
And also, we might be declaring war in a day, so get ready.
Yeah, well, and I mean,
and Superman would sadly have to be the person to enforce that, and he could make Wonder Woman leave if he wanted to.
So, and the other thing is that, like with diplomatic immunity, that you either have to leave or the nation who you belong to can revoke the immunity, and
then we can arrest them and jail them.
And you can actually, depending on the nature of the offense, a criminal with diplomatic immunity can be like arrested pending extradition or renunciation of his immunity. So
see, that's why you got to be like Doctor Doom. You run your own country. You can't revoke it on yourself.
Well, I think that you can to some degree. Diana could revoke her own immunity.
Yeah, well, it's because she's a princess.
Yeah,
that's possible. Because like the legal structure within the Themyscira is a little wishy-washy.
Speaking of which, do you remember when Superman basically was like, I could peel that armor off you, Dr. Doom? And Doom was like, I got diplomatic immunity. And Superman was like, aw.
Which again, I'm going to be like, yeah.
That's essentially what happened.
I don't remember that, but that's amazing. What is that?
Was that in the original Spider-Man Superman?
I believe that's
team-up?
the Spider-Man. I believe that's the Spider-Man versus Superman story. And Doom,
that's amazing.
yeah. And Superman's like, guess my hands are tied.
Ah, shucks.
Yeah.
And
because again, who's going to actually punish me if I went and did it?
And Superman brought Parasite into the equation. So it was Parasite and Doctor Doom for the two villains for the book.
Oh man,
I might have to go back and read that. I've actually never read that.
yeah, that sounds fun. Okay, so let's move on from the DC universe here, because we can't talk all night. So
No, at a certain
one of the
point we
things-
got to talk about Youngbloods, don't we?
the one I wanted to bring up that has bothered me since I first saw it. I love the movie, but it's still sort of something about it, just like The Incredibles.
Oh yeah.
And I hate The Incredibles because one, like every operating superhero is a government agent, and
Yep.
like, that's not really superheroes, but okay. Two, the government, they're all government agents, but the government caves to a guy making a ridiculously baseless lawsuit that would get thrown out like that.
No. The government caves to a massive tsunami of lawsuits that happen after as a result.
Here's the problem. Here's the problem with that. If we were to bring reality to this formula, there's a concept called sovereign immunity, which says that the government has a liability cap on lawsuits against them for negligence.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be like incredible gross negligence. Like, you passed approval on a bridge that you knew was bad, and typically it's not the government; it's the specific government agent or guy who's in trouble, not the government.
But when the government has to take responsibility in situations like that, they have to pass specific legislation to cover excess from their sovereign immunity.
So I don't know.
People will yell and scream and go running to Big Brother to fix it.
I don't know if it was specifically just. I don't think the superheroes were specifically government agents in The Incredibles. I think they had a government liaison.
I know it's a fan theory.
So I don't think it was. I don't think it was explicitly spelled out, but the impression I got was that they had like a SHIELD government liaison that essentially like helped them out and kind of gave them a certain level of like approval.
And gave them supercars and fancy technology.
It was liaison. It was liaison. It was like it wasn't like you officially like there was no documentation to that.
And there were a lot of it was it was like a private contract. I would say all the superheroes were private contractors in that case because they also privately contracted different people like Edna who made like super suits and stuff for people.
But the thing is who was paying her? They're not rich people. They're just normal people. They don't have to pay any of their own bills.
So
they're operating completely on their own.
No, they had to. What are you talking about? Bob had to pay all his own bills.
When he was no longer a superhero, he had to get a day job. Before that, he had a car that there's no way a dude his age could afford. He had a secret base. He had all this kind of stuff. It was ridiculous. Obviously,
I would never.
Wait. He didn't have. Hold on.
The thing is, I would never.
I don't think he had a base.
No, not a base. But
where do you keep the Incredicar?
I would never.
real quick,
Pixar.
He's got a point.
Real quick, I just want to say I got to dip out, guys. I got to go to work tomorrow morning. So
Yeah,
thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Of course, man. Have a good one.
Here's the deal. I would never accuse Pixar of doing their world building. As far as I know, a lot of the theories about how the government fits into this tend to come very recently from fan theories of people thinking that the government were supposed to create them and stuff. And maybe there was original ideas in the script that never made it to the final movie. As a kid, I simply saw a scenario where individual heroes found themselves in the sights of a bunch of lawsuits, and that caused people to yell and scream and get the government to crack down on things. And at that point,
the government was definitely involved from the very beginning.
Yeah,
I never saw it that way.
So the way I see it is
as I was an adult who had to pay taxes, and I said, those assholes are using all of my money on that credit card.
Yeah. So the way I saw it is that they were basically private agents that the government contracted, and the second they became more liable than the government was willing to put up.
Reese, I got you dead to rights. Sorry. Yeah. I got you dead to rights. Okay, so as someone who has watched all of the special features and Easter eggs on the Incredibles DVD, I know for a fact that Bob can afford the Incredicar because the superheroes did endorsements. And if you watch all the special features, you actually get to see the cartoon that they made.
I remember that now.
It's a fake cartoon they made where he was supposed to endorse
because the government
things.
never fronts the bill for propaganda.
I'm just telling you, there is an alternate explanation here, and it's actually supplied in the lore.
You don't get an Incredicar with Roger Ramjet money.
Yeah. Oh, don't give me that crap. You could totally the amount of endorsements you can get as a superhero. As a superhero, you can get plenty of money.
Those animations are so incredibly poor in the 50s because those guys were putting together with a shoelace.
No. That part,
it wasn't just that.
But the money,
car dealerships, everything. They were public figures.
Yeah, exactly. No. Yeah. They were on the cover of Time magazine. No, I got this one.
Okay. And in the second,
don't ask Pixar to answer this for you.
And
they were private contractors.
And in the second movie, Miss Incredible.
Don't even talk nonsense. They made one movie twice. It's a gender swap. It's not even a second thing. You can't even. There's no lore involved in it.
But still, Miss Incredible was sponsored by a corporation when she was attempting to bring superheroes back.
That's an entirely different
for the sake of that, you are correct, but that's because they were working to pass a law that was only quasi being enforced because it was illegal to operate as superheroes at that point.
Right. Here's the deal. The people at Pixar were literally asked in an interview about why Buzz Lightyear knows that he should drop dead and play a toy when Andy comes in the room when he thinks that he's the real Buzz Lightyear. Their answer was literally, "It's a movie. Don't think about it."
Well, that's a horrible answer.
Well, that's
It
also why I
is.
stopped watching
But
Pixar movies. So
The point
I
is,
started
don't
thinking
ask
about
them
it. It was no longer
to
fun.
give you the details enough to answer questions like this. They're not going to do it.
Yeah.
We don't
job
care
is
about
to
their
make
answers.
A one-time
We
movie,
can
and
we
it's
can get
over
answers from watching the movie. You can discern things from context clues
Well, that's what I'm saying.
that
Like,
even the
all of
creators
this
don't
is just
understand.
fan theories and stuff we're coming up with now.
So anyway, I know to answer Neostar's question, I don't hate The Incredibles. I hate the setup to The Incredibles. Everything after that initial scene, him living a life and trying to figure it out and rediscovering his manhood and rediscovering what it means to be a dad and a husband. That's all really good. And I part
like
of the reason I
one.
dislike
The
the
first one's
second
really good.
movie is it actually like disregards all of the character growth in the first movie. It inverts the nature of their characters and gives Helen a middle-aged man's story just to have a yo girl boss moment. And so it's untrue to the premises of the first movie, and that's why I didn't like it. Also, I didn't like the second Blade movie because it disallowed the premises of the first Blade movie.
My issue
Blade
with
3 was really fun.
Blade
my
3 was
issue
fun.
with
It wasn't great, but it was fun.
my issue with
fun, that's all.
Incredibles 2 is that it's the same one as the first, but
Mhm.
it's a little bit less good on every point. So it's like I might as well just watch the first one again. That was my issue. Is I was like, wow, this
Yeah, I
is the
think
same beat. This is the same
the
beat, but
only
not as
thing I
not as
liked
effective every time.
in the second one was after the adults lost and it was like the kids were trying to do things. Like there was a little fun sequence there,
Yeah.
but not enough to actually carry the movie.
Well, and the villain like in the second one was kind of interesting. I mean, it was basically the same like motivation as Syndrome, but like visually appealing was a little bit different. And I like the mesmerization aspect. That was kind of fun because if you like old TVs, it kind of has a fit into that analog side. So there was some aesthetic stuff that was fun. But the crazy thing was, I really enjoyed how like and not in a good way, mind you. But Brad Bird, I read an interview with him after I was so disappointed with Incredibles 2. I went back and I was like, why do I hate this so bad? So because at first it was just this guttural hatred that was deep in my soul, not the normal guttural hatred, but a different one. And I was trying to put a finger on it. And I was like, I went back and I read an interview with him, and he's like, "Oh man, it took us so long to get back to that." And I went back and I watched the real film because I didn't want to. And I'm like, "Did you watch the real one?" And just like, "Oh, that was really good. Let's do that one again." How did you? Because at first I thought that he just forget what he wrote in the first movie. So he went back and like just went to his stock points that he like storytelling things that we all have cliches that are in our head that we think about all the time, right? So is he just like hitting his personal cliches, or what's the story? Did he just not watch it again to see what he'd already? Oh no. He watched it. He did what he studied it and is like, okay, I'm doing that exact thing again.
The problem is they didn't
I
actually
love
have
my
a plot
movie. I should do that again.
they used the plot of the sequel on a video game already, so they had to do something else.
Oh, yeah,
Because
the
Rise of the
Underminer one,
Underminer
yeah.
was already a good sequel. You just had to play a game to get it.
Yeah, and I never got
I
around
don't
to
know.
playing that game.
I don't know if if I would put a whole movie on Underminer, but personally, but I do remember the video. game.
Seven in the chat says Screenslaver was an ingenious villain. I agree, but the motivations are just Syndrome's motivations.
He was cool. Screenslaver was cool.
It was,
The fight between him and Elastigirl is probably the highlight of the film.
Yeah,
it's
I think
one of the few parts. One of the few parts.
The action in the second Incredibles movie that doesn't exist. The action is fun. It's just there's no weight to it because I don't buy the character's motivations at all.
I think I'm a little more gracious, but I was just like, wow, this moment that happened again was so much better the first time I experienced it. That's what I kept getting hit by. I was like, wow, on the island, this was a really good moment. Here, I'm kind of ambivalent. Wow, this was really good on the island. I'm ambivalent again. Golly gee, this whole film just feels this way. That was my
One thing that annoys me about The Incredibles in either one, although I think they did a little bit better in the second, is that they've placed this in like the 1960s, and they have every opportunity to really explore a retroactive culture like that, and they do about 10% actual commitment to doing so. And I probably was an adult before I even realized it was supposed to be in the past and not just a modern day film.
You would not like Archer.
I love Archer.
I love
probably
Archer.
not.
Archer's fantastic. I'm just saying, your pitch there is essentially is what Archer is, which is this should be the '60s, but
Well, that's what
yeah.
this '70s show is really not about the '70s.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's
Yeah, that's
incapable
true.
of
This has been a blast. I actually have to bounce,
okay.
but thank you so much for letting me jump in and derail things.
No, that's fine. Actually, no, you're a perfectly appropriate moment to discuss that with a history of the DC universe. So.
Yeah, and you gave me the perfect segue to jump onto the thing I wanted to talk from the beginning.
Okay,
with
the conspiracy.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Good talking to you all.
Yeah, we'll
Read
catch you later, man.
And yeah, I'll see you guys next week whatever insanity we're doing.
Yeah. Oh, next week is the political inclinations of superheroes.
Ooh, I'm gonna enjoy that one.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds fun.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've got it involves real homework that I haven't prepared yet. But
Oh,
that's
boy. All right, peace out.
okay. So
Okay, well, I guess he can't chime in because I was going to change the subject. Still on the topic of the video, but Cartoonicus is here, who also works on the same story. Because it was for both of you guys, because you have stories where registration isn't even a question. It's almost just like because they go to
Just
schools for this
assumed.
stuff.
Right.
Yeah, everybody already knows who everyone is. For the most part, like obviously there's weeds here and there, but it's
keep
just
talking. I'm gonna
on
have
the
to bring
table.
something up probably, but go on.
Yeah. So like,
Or was that it?
Well, that was pretty much just the
okay.
topic change.
Because
itself, you know.
I'm actually going to bring up a very specific. Oops, if my internet works here. A very specific strip we did early on that I'm only now realizing is so perfect for this.
While you're loading that up there, we haven't talked about MHA. That's very true. Fizz, we definitely want to. I wanted to get around to that, so we will definitely be doing that. Neo says, CC, I mean, you were expecting the time period to overshadow the superheroes living in it. You have characters with powers, personalities, and items that stand off from the rest of society. I think that more has to do with the fact that the setting was this retro 60s spy-filled James Bondy thing in name only. They didn't really so it lost its sheen except for the soundtrack if you paid too close attention to it.
Soundtrack is great in that.
Which is so you have, and that's one of the things that bothered me about the second movie so much is that the first movie at least played with the concept of the nuclear family and how those character dynamics, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a father, what it means to be a wife, what it means to be a child, and all those dynamics are an intrinsic part of the first movie. And in the second movie, it's just like, okay, so we're gonna do daddy daycare and what's that? Was that Kevin? I mean, Michael Keaton did a Dad Stays at Home movie, Mr. Mom and Girl Boss.
Mr. Mom's gonna be Batman? What?
But I totally agree with all that. But I did appreciate
have
the visuals a little more. They have this character who's basically supposed to be Walt Disney, and we see how he dresses, and his office is decorated and everything. They get into the house, and the whole thing is designed with this really cool looking,
mid-century
constructionist architecture and all that. Some of the stuff looked totally modern, and I was like, yeah, why on earth do they have an electric bike that looks like that at this time? But I do think they did a bit more than the first movie did.
Well, my point was when you take all of those themes in it that are so out of place with the texture of the piece, it just makes it feel disjointed. So you can't really, if you're familiar with the texture, if you're familiar with that mid-century kitsch, you don't really feel, you can't settle into it because it's, for me anyway, that was my expression, is you can't settle into the setting because you're being ramrodded by all this, this other piece that doesn't, it's disjointing in a way that doesn't fit. I mean, that's Watchmen is a good example of the inverse of this, right? So like, I don't necessarily agree with the politics in Watchmen, but the politics is timely to the setting the story takes place in, right? So there is a zeitgeist that's in place in Watchmen that reinforces the political subtext of that story. So
Also, don't forget that was during the same time frame that Ronald Reagan made his famous space alien speech to the UN.
Why does everything always revolve around Reagan in these comics?
Well,
because Reagan was hugely influential. So influential that Superman had to impersonate Reagan during a plot event to protect him. So there's a scene of President Reagan punching some terrorists. That's great.
Well, and Booster Gold went back in time to save Reagan too. So
yeah.
Okay, so back to Super School. Did you find that strip yet there, Cartoonica?
Yes. So
excellent.
Sorry,
Let's take a look at that.
This up here. Yeah, to address your issue about the obviousness of certain scenarios existing. Let's say Super School.
I didn't have an issue. I just thought it'd be a fun topic. Since
No, just the issue, not
No.
like you have an issue. This was our origin story for Captain Stupendous. Basically, he has done so much damage in trying to be a superhero his entire life. He is a wanted criminal, and that's why he has to constantly keep his identity a secret and has come to be the principal of the superhero school. Now, just to nail this home, in a much later chapter, we also discover he's basically been embezzling funds from the school to pay for his lavish office. And then even later, actually the chapter we're doing right now, the alternate variation where they change time, he ends up being president. So in way after way, this guy is constantly in the he's kind of the origin of whatever system we've got, is usually because he is so much more than just a single hero, or villain in this case. He's always either the reason somebody did something, or he's doing something himself and causing it all to happen.
That's pretty stupendous.
So yeah.
So in some ways, you kind of just exist in almost like a post-registration world, and that's why there's like schools and stuff in the first place.
I haven't brought it up to Twitless yet, but I've been meaning to suggest, what if after all this time, the person who's been doing all this this narrating turns out to be Stupendous?
That would be funny.
That's amazing. So yeah, in Forces similarly, we have a world where superhero registration exists, but it's not necessarily national. And so there are stuff that I'm not going to get into with that because it's plot points for future stories. But for example, in Fremont, Colorado, where the expositioner lives, if you're not licensed with the city has a single contract for powered heroes with the Remus Corps, and if you're not contracted with Remus Corps and you're operating in city limits, then that's a felony under Colorado law. So it's a city statute that's enforced with under Colorado law. But in Urbania, which is our big East Coast, one of our big East Coast cities, it's down in North Carolina. It's a mecca for superheroes. They don't have a registration overtly in Urbania at all. Very state to state in our universe. So there you go. We've talked about that.
But government agents are definitely involved, as you see in like the very, very beginning of Forces.
Yes, very, very first page of Force of Good and Evil. Well, second page of Force of Good and Evil. So, yep. Agent Smith is a favorite of mine. So, but I'm not going to tell you which agency he works for.
Matrix.
It's probably just better that way.
It'll come out eventually. So let's talk a little My Hero Academia and then wrap it up. Does that sound like a good thing?
To?
Yes. No. Of course we do.
We can.
It's
fine.
It's huge. It's hugely influential.
Actually,
we got to see how the Japanese look at this stuff.
In that subject, the only thing I liked that came out of My Hero was the Vigilante spin-off comic. So
yeah,
I guess it has to do with the topic.
Yeah. I love Vigilantes. It's a great book. I read the first volume and a half I got from the library a couple of years ago, and I started collecting the Tagaban here recently. So I've been reading through them, and I'm loving it, loving it. But I also like the main series, and they have it's the setup in the superhero schools, and the purpose of the schools is to produce licensed heroes for Japan, right? And in that's a plot point is that Japan in My Hero has all registered heroes. And of course, the premise of their universe is like 80% of the population has superpowers, but a lot of them suck. So not everybody has the temperament or the class of power to be a professional hero. And so people still need protecting from monsters and from villains who are greatly powerful and that kind of thing.
Well, and it makes sense too with the history of Japan. If you look at it, even today, like cops don't even have guns in Japan, right? But then if you look historically, everybody outside of very few circumstances was in the employ or served under whatever the local government. Like if you go back to militia, samurai, and stuff, it was very much like the knight system, where it's like you were under somebody. It was basically a registered system. You kind of knew who belonged to who.
Yeah, and so I think
it sounds like somebody's asleep.
It could be.
Didn't that happen once before?
Yes,
it did. It did, but it didn't happen this time.
Oh, okay. Ray Cortex has appeared. But yeah, and I think it's a particularly fitting in Japan because it fits in with their societal structure. And in fact, it's something that has shown up not just in My Hero, but One Punch Man uses a similar setting. And I don't know if that's necessarily supposed to be exactly Japan or if it's definitely not Japan.
It is a world where the cities are so big that the cities themselves are more than just city states. They're like city countries, right? That span everything. And there's like one for each letter. But it's kind of culturally Japan, just spanning the whole world.
Right.
So if the cities are all letters, then that means that Excel Sagas could be happening in the same universe as One Punch Man.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know.
So Japan got superhumans, and they basically wrote a story in which they successfully took over the world.
No. It's an alt world. It's just because it's written by Japanese people, the world is kind of culturally Japan. It's not supposed to be like any given area.
Now that's kind of fits into what I was saying about how you can basically rearrange history if you have to. So here they've just done exactly that and created their own world where they can write things the way they want to.
Right, and it's a similar framework in Chainsaw Man too, where it's an alternate history Japan, but the paranormal beings, instead of necessarily being superheroes like we would imagine them, they're either demonic villains or heroes who use demonic forces to fight other devils, right? So but it's still you go back framework where Denji, as Denji begins, he's a free contract demon hunter, devil hunter, right? And then as it moves on, he falls under the sway and becomes necessarily a contract of a government contractor for the government. And so but it still kind of falls into that there are freelance demon hunters, devil hunters, but they don't have any legal protections that can be afforded, whereas if you work for the government, then you have the color of law, you have legal protections, you have insurance, you have benefits, you have a government provided apartment, all that kind of stuff. And so it's still there is a meshing with the concepts that MHA makes explicitly superheroes.
I like how One Punch Man, everything's like hyper competitive, which I think is a reflection of working in the manga industry or trying to get into it, because he was trying to get into the manga industry at the time. And if you know most industries in Japan, they're like hyper competitive, that you're either producing and you're getting on top or you're dying. Right. And I see this reflective in like how the hero system is, and like there's tier lists, like you become like an A tier, S tier hero, and you're like working up the leaderboard, saving people, popularity and stuff like that. But I could see that actually being viable in a real system, because it's a way that like the government or even private corporation, whatever runs it, could get you to basically handle yourself without them having to be too involved into it.
Well, and that's the same. They have that same kind of system in MHA too, right?
Yeah.
Where like All Might, when we first meet him, All Might is the #1 hero of Japan, and he's voted. He's won the last like 7 popularity contests, and they do that. And so that still falls into that concept, but it doesn't. And the thing that's strange to me is I find the situation of hero registration to be so antithetical in American comics to the very premises of what American hero comics are. But I love MHA, right? I really, really love that comic.
And it makes sense to their culture.
And it makes sense in their culture, right? But I also love Vigilante, right?
Which there is also precedent in their culture too, right? Because it's the Ronin, the samurai who serves no lord.
Right. And so Vigilante, and also there's lots of reasons I like Vigilantes, but a big part of it is because it has that more individuated concept.
Yeah.
But whereas in the main line, it's still, the expectation is to work for the government, for the public good in that framework. But I don't necessarily like that part of it in that story. I accept it because it culturally fits. But also I find the dynamics between the different characters to be really compelling, and how I think they do a really good job of fleshing out the B stories and how they fold into the A story. So, so that I think that's fun, and I'm excited to see where it goes. But I don't have the same visceral like hatred of as I do of Civil War, even though the world they suggest is very similar.
Yeah. Well, part of it too is this is why I tend to like One Punch Man more, because it is more in that kind of like satire area, but it is taking itself seriously for what it is. It's like it's a comedy, but it's kind of playing itself straight. Like whatever things they come up with, one just rides with it as if that's just the way the world works.
Yeah.
But his is almost like a satire, a parody for the love of superhero comics, and there's a little bit of that in My Hero, but you could tell that My Hero is also very much a deconstruction as well. That's kind of part superhero, but it's also obviously part like Naruto, because it's doing a lot of the same stuff. There's like a genre in Japanese storytelling, and I actually would probably say that My Hero is closer to The Boys than any other story, especially the further it goes into it.
Which I've not read The Boys.
Yeah.
That's
which
one
I
of
also don't really like.
Well, and that's one of the topics that I kind of wanted to address, but I don't know enough about it. I know that superhero registration is an intrinsic part of that world, but I don't know enough about it. And I think Twitless has read it, so I was going to lean on him talk about it, but he had to leave. So,
and I think a separate topic that we really need to dig into more is all the times the superheroes took over the government.
Oh.
Yeah,
we didn't have time for that.
And how those are dumb ideas each and every time it comes up.
Well, maybe that's a definite maybe. We'll put it on the list. So, okay, guys, I think that's a show. What do you think? I'm feeling pretty good about that.
I think we did good on this topic. We banged this topic up.
I feel, and you guys in the chat, tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like if we hammer this anymore, that horse done died.
Yeah.
I think it all comes back to what I said in the very beginning. None of it makes sense if you try to think about it.
So, well, I don't know if that's true, but we can hash that out later. Tonight, we're going to wrap it up, and Fizz is dropping little boys stuff in the chat. Appreciate that. And think here. Anyway, we're gonna call it next week the political beliefs of superheroes. It's gonna be a wild ride, and I'm gonna disagree with everyone. I'm so excited. So
I think most superheroes are apolitical. So we'll get into that.
Would there be like an entire section of politics devoted to the concept of superheroes?
Yeah, well,
including what we talked about tonight.
Yeah. There's nothing is apolitical. Good night, guys. So,
Mm.
but yeah, go check out Lone Wolf. Vestry's got a day and a half left. If you haven't backed Vestry, you don't love comics, or you don't have money. I don't want to get you too much out there. Everybody's struggling, but Vestry, super excited for that book. Legends of Lone Wolf, super excited for that one. So, and I mean, coming in at the end, George Bush superhero oil for the win. Wow, there's a ice cold take. Also, oil is the best chance of bringing people out of poverty, guys. Come on.
Yeah.
Good night. We'll call it. And next week, until next week, keep reading comics.
Keep reading comics.